Imagine waking up one morning to discover that someone you buried 30 years ago is still alive. Not a ghost, not a mistake in paperwork, a living, breathing person who simply vanished. In the summer of 1995, a woman named Linda Carmichael walked into a police station in Portland, Oregon, and asked a question that would shatter 3 decades of grief. "Is anyone still looking for me?" The officers stared at her, confused, until she gave them a name that had been etched on a gravestone since 1965, a name that appeared in old missing persons files marked presumed deceased, a name that belonged to a girl who disappeared at age 16 and was never seen again, until now. To understand how someone could be declared dead while still alive, we need to go back to a different America. The year was 1964, and the small town of Crescent Falls, Washington, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were hard to keep. Linda Carmichael was a bright-eyed, dark-haired teenager who loved reading mystery novels and dreamed of becoming a journalist. She lived with her parents, Robert and Margaret Carmichael, and her younger brother, Tommy, in a modest 2-story house on Elm Street. Neighbors described Linda as quiet but curious, always asking questions, always watching. Her mother once told a friend that Linda had eyes that saw too much for someone so young. But beneath the surface of their seemingly normal life, the Carmichael household was cracking. Robert Carmichael, a middle manager at a local timber company, had recently been drinking heavily, often coming home late with alcohol on his breath and anger in his voice. Margaret, a homemaker who once sang in the church choir, had grown withdrawn and anxious, jumping at sudden noises and wearing long sleeves even in summer. Neighbors occasionally heard raised voices through the walls, but this was 1964. People didn't interfere in family matters. Linda confided in her best friend, Susan Hartley, that things at home were getting worse, though she never explained exactly what that meant. Susan would later say those words haunted her for decades. On September 14, 1964, Linda Carmichael left for school at 7:30 in the morning, carrying her book bag and wearing a blue cardigan her grandmother had knitted. She attended her first 3 classes at Crescent Falls High School, English, history, and biology, and was marked present in the attendance records. But when the lunch bell rang at noon, Linda didn't go to the cafeteria. Instead, according to one classmate who saw her in the hallway, she walked toward the main exit with a strange, determined look on her face. That classmate, Jennifer Moore, remembered thinking it was odd because Linda never skipped class. By the time the final bell rang at 3 o'clock, Linda Carmichael had vanished. When Linda didn't come home that evening, Margaret Carmichael initially assumed her daughter was studying at the library or visiting Susan. But by 8 o'clock, when darkness had fallen and Linda still hadn't returned, panic set in. Robert called Susan's house. Linda hadn't been there. He called the library. They hadn't seen her. By 9 o'clock, he was at the police station filing a missing persons report, his hands shaking as he filled out the forms. The desk sergeant, a man named Earl Patterson, took down the details with the weary efficiency of someone who'd seen dozens of runaway cases. "She'll probably turn up in a day or 2, he told Robert. "Teenage girls get dramatic sometimes." But Robert Carmichael, despite all his flaws, knew his daughter. "Not Linda," he whispered. "Something's wrong." The initial search was extensive, at least by 1964 standards. Police officers combed the woods surrounding Crescent Falls. Volunteers checked abandoned buildings, and search dogs tracked Linda's scent from the school to the edge of town, before losing it completely near the old railroad bridge. Her face appeared on missing person posters, stapled to telephone poles, and taped in shop windows. The local newspaper ran a front-page story, "Local teen vanishes, family desperate for answers." For 3 weeks, the entire town seemed mobilized, driven by equal parts genuine concern and morbid curiosity. But as September turned to October and October turned to November, the search efforts began to fade. People had jobs to return to, lives to live. The volunteers stopped showing up. The newspaper moved on to other stories. And then, on December 3, 1964, everything changed. A hunter named Bill Crawford was tracking deer in the dense forest about 40 miles north of Crescent Falls when he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Partially hidden beneath fallen leaves and branches, he found a girl's blue cardigan, torn and stained with what appeared to be blood. Nearby, scattered among the undergrowth, were a book bag, a pair of shoes, and a student ID card. The name on the card read, Linda Marie Carmichael. Bill Crawford ran back to his truck and drove straight to the nearest police station, the items wrapped carefully in a blanket. When the forensic tests came back, they confirmed the stains were human blood, type O negative, Linda's blood type. The discovery transformed a missing persons case into an assumed homicide. The police returned to the forest with larger teams, cadaver dogs, and renewed urgency. They searched every inch of the surrounding area looking for a body, a grave, any sign of Linda Carmichael's remains. But they found nothing. No body, no bones. No evidence of where Linda might have gone after losing her cardigan and belongings in those dark woods. The lead detective, James Morrison, theorized that Linda had been abducted, taken to the forest, murdered, and her body disposed of in a way that made it impossible to find. Perhaps buried deep. Perhaps thrown into the river that ran through the gorge a mile away. Without a body, however, they couldn't officially declare her dead. The case remained open but increasingly cold. For the Carmichael family, the absence of closure was a special kind of torture. Robert quit his job at the timber company and spent his days driving through nearby towns, showing Linda's photograph to strangers, asking if anyone had seen her. Margaret stopped leaving the house altogether, sitting by the window for hours, waiting for a daughter who would never walk through the door. Young Tommy, only 12 years old when his sister disappeared, grew up in a home haunted by grief and unanswered questions. In 1972, 8 years after Linda's disappearance, the Carmichael family made a painful decision. They petitioned the court to declare Linda legally dead. The judge, sympathetic to their need for closure, granted the request. A death certificate was issued. A memorial service was held. A gravestone was placed in Crescent Falls Cemetery, bearing the inscription, Linda Marie Carmichael, 1948 to 1964, forever in our hearts. But Linda Carmichael wasn't dead. She was alive, living under a different name, in a different state, carrying a secret so heavy it had nearly crushed her for 3 decades. And on that summer day in 1995, when she finally walked into that Portland police station, she was ready to tell the truth. But the truth, as it turned out, was far more complicated and disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The officer who took her statement, Detective Rachel Torres, later said it was the most surreal moment of her career. She sat down, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "My name is Linda Carmichael. I've been missing since 1964, and I need to tell you what really happened." What Linda revealed over the next 4 hours would not only rewrite the story of her disappearance, but expose a tragic failure of protection, communication, and justice. She began at the beginning, speaking in a voice that was calm but carried the weight of decades of silence. "My father wasn't just a drinker," she said. "He was violent. He hit my mother regularly. He hit me, and in the months before I disappeared, it was getting worse." Linda described a home life that was a carefully maintained facade, pleasant on the outside, nightmarish behind closed doors. She spoke of her mother's bruises, hidden beneath makeup and long sleeves. She spoke of her own fear, growing sharper each day, that one night her father would go too far. "I knew I had to leave," Linda told Detective Torres. "But I was 16, I had no money, nowhere to go. I felt trapped." The plan came together quickly, desperately, in the days before her disappearance. Linda had been saving small amounts of money from her part-time job at the local diner. $1 here, 50 cents there, hiding it in a hollowed-out book on her shelf. She had exactly $37 when she decided to run. On September 14, 1964, she attended her morning classes as usual, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. But during the lunch break, she walked out of the school, headed to the bus station at the edge of town, and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle. The bus driver barely looked at her. No one asked questions. In 1964, teenage runaways were common enough that they'd become invisible. Linda Carmichael, terrified but determined, boarded that bus and left her old life behind. But here's where the story takes its first devastating turn. Linda never made it to Seattle, or rather she did, but not on that bus. 20 miles outside of Crescent Falls, near that same railroad bridge where search dogs would later lose her scent, the bus made a routine stop at a small gas station. Linda got off to use the restroom, and that's when she saw him, her father. Robert Carmichael was standing next to his car in the parking lot, scanning the area with wild, desperate eyes. "I don't know if he was looking for me specifically or just happened to stop at the same place," Linda later explained. "But I panicked. I couldn't get back on the bus without him seeing me. So I ran." She ran into the woods bordering the gas station, her book bag bouncing against her back, her heart hammering in her chest. She ran for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, branches tearing at her clothes, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She thought she heard her father's voice calling her name, though she could never be sure if that was real or her imagination. At some point, she tripped over a fallen log and crashed to the ground, her cardigan snagging on a sharp branch and tearing. When she looked down, she saw blood. She'd cut her arm on a rock, and the blood was soaking into her sleeve and dripping onto the cardigan. Terrified that her father might track her by the blood trail, Linda made a split-second decision. She took off the cardigan, stuffed it under some leaves along with her book bag and shoes. They were slowing her down and kept running, now in just her dress and socks. She had no idea that this desperate act would become evidence of her own murder. Linda eventually made it to a different road, several miles from where she'd started. By then it was late afternoon, and she was exhausted, bleeding, and nearly barefoot. A woman in a station wagon pulled over, concerned by the sight of a teenage girl stumbling along the roadside. "Are you okay, honey?" the woman asked. Linda lied. She said her name was Bate, that she'd been hiking and gotten lost. The woman, whose name Linda never learned, drove her to a truck stop near the interstate and offered her $20. "Get yourself cleaned up and call your parents," the woman said kindly. Linda nodded, took the money, and watched the station wagon drive away. Then she walked into the truck stop, washed her arm in the bathroom, and used the $20 plus her remaining savings to buy food and a ticket for a ride with a long-haul trucker heading south. His name was Hank. He didn't ask questions, and just like that, Linda Carmichael disappeared. For the next several weeks, Linda moved from place to place, state to state, staying in cheap motels, sleeping in bus stations, living on crackers and whatever food she could afford. She was terrified of being found, terrified of going back. "I kept thinking my father would track me down," she told Detective Torres. "I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him." Eventually, she ended up in a small town in Northern California, where she got a job washing dishes at a diner, no questions asked. She told people her name was Elizabeth Carter, Bate Carter, and that she was 18, old enough to work without parental permission. No one checked. In 1964, background checks were rare, social security numbers were loosely monitored, and a teenage girl could reinvent herself with nothing more than a lie and some confidence. Linda, now Bate, worked at that diner for nearly 3 years. She rented a tiny room above a hardware store, kept her head down, and tried to build something resembling a normal life. She made friends cautiously, never revealing too much. She saved money. She even enrolled in night classes at the local community college, studying under her false name, dreaming of the journalism career she'd once wanted. But she never stopped looking over her shoulder. She never stopped wondering if her family was searching for her. She never stopped feeling the weight of what she'd done, not just running away, but disappearing so completely that they probably thought she was dead. "I thought about calling them 1,000 times, Linda said, tears streaming down her face during the police interview. "But I was so afraid, afraid of my father, afraid of what I'd put them through, afraid they'd hate me." And then one day in 1967, Linda saw a newspaper article that changed everything. She was sitting in the diner on her break, flipping through an old copy of a Seattle newspaper that a trucker had left behind, when she saw the headline, "Missing Washington Teen Still Sought by Family." There was a photograph, her photograph, the one from her sophomore year school portrait, and an article about her disappearance. But what made her blood run cold was the last paragraph. It mentioned that police had found her belongings in the forest, blood-stained and abandoned. That investigators believed she'd been the victim of foul play. That her family was mourning the daughter they believed was dead or dying somewhere, lost forever. Linda felt the walls closing in. She realized that by running, by trying to save herself, she'd accidentally convinced everyone that she'd been murdered. She should have called the police then. Should have revealed herself, explained what happened, ended her family's suffering. But fear paralyzed her. "I convinced myself that if I came forward, my father would find out where I was and come for me," she explained to Detective Torres. "I convinced myself that everyone would hate me for putting them through this. I convinced myself it was better if they thought I was dead than know the truth, that I'd run away and let them suffer." So Linda Carter, the girl who used to be Linda Carmichael, made a choice that would haunt her for the next 28 years. She folded up the newspaper, threw it in the trash, and went back to work. She buried her past life deeper than any grave, and she tried to move forward. The years passed. Linda moved again, this time to Oregon, where she felt safer, further from Washington, further from her past. She got a job at a library, a position that felt right, close to the books she'd always loved. She legally changed her name to Elizabeth Jane Carter through a simple court process. Easier to do in the 1970s than it would be later. She filed taxes under that name, opened a bank account, built a credit history. She even had relationships, though she never let anyone get too close. How could she? Her entire identity was a lie. One boyfriend proposed to her in 1979, and she said no, breaking his heart without being able to explain why. "I couldn't marry him," she told Detective Torres. "Marriage meant paperwork, background checks, questions I couldn't answer. I couldn't let anyone that far in." Linda Carter lived a quiet, lonely life. She was well liked by her coworkers but maintained careful boundaries. She attended community events but always stayed on the periphery. She created a persona, friendly but private, pleasant but unreachable. It was exhausting, she admitted. Every conversation was a potential trap. Every new acquaintance was someone who might ask the wrong question, connect the wrong dots, unravel everything. She never contacted her family. She never called, never wrote, never sent any signal that she was alive. Over the years, she occasionally found news articles about herself, updates on the cold case, anniversary pieces about her disappearance, interviews with her grieving mother. Each one was a knife to the heart. In 1972, when she learned through a newspaper archive that she'd been declared legally dead, she locked herself in her apartment and cried for 3 days straight. "I attended my own funeral," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not physically, I couldn't risk it, but I found the cemetery records. I know where my gravestone is. I know what it says." Detective Torres asked her the obvious question. Why not come forward then? Why continue the lie? Linda's answer was raw and heartbreaking. "Because by then I'd been dead for 8 years. How do you come back from that? How do you tell your mother? Hi, I'm not actually dead. I've just been living under a fake name and letting you suffer for almost a decade." The longer I stayed silent, the more impossible it became to speak. She paused, wiping her eyes. "I convinced myself that coming forward would hurt them more than staying gone. I convinced myself they'd moved on, found peace. I convinced myself it was better this way." But the world didn't stay still. As the years rolled into the 1980s and then the 1990s, technology advanced in ways that made Linda increasingly nervous. Computers became common. Databases were interconnected. Background checks became more sophisticated. In 1993, Linda was offered a promotion at the library, but it required a more thorough background check than she'd ever faced before. She panicked and declined the position, claiming personal reasons. A coworker, concerned, asked if everything was okay. "I'm fine," Linda lied, the way she'd been lying for almost 30 years. But she wasn't fine. The weight of her secret was crushing her. She'd spent 3 decades running from the past, and it was finally catching up. In 1994, Linda began seeing a therapist. She didn't tell the therapist her real name, couldn't risk it, but she talked around the edges of her secret, discussing major life decisions and unresolved family issues and guilt over past actions. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patricia Reynolds, sensed there was something deeper but didn't push. Over months of sessions, Dr. Reynolds helped Linda understand something crucial, that living with a lie was worse than facing the truth, no matter how painful. "She asked me once, 'What's the worst thing that could happen if you told the truth?'" Linda recalled. "And I realized the worst thing had already happened. I'd lost 30 years. I'd lost my family. I'd lost myself. What more was there to lose?" That conversation planted a seed. Slowly, painfully, Linda began to consider the impossible coming forward. But there was another reason, a more urgent reason, that finally pushed Linda to reveal herself. In early 1995, Linda learned through a chance encounter with someone from Washington, a tourist who happened to mention Crescent Falls in conversation, that her mother was dying. Margaret Carmichael had been diagnosed with late-stage cancer and was in hospice care. Linda felt time collapsing around her. 30 years of silence, and now her mother, the woman she'd been trying to protect in her own misguided way, was dying without ever knowing the truth. "I realized I had a choice," Linda said. "I could let my mother die thinking her daughter had been murdered, or I could give her the truth, even if it destroyed me in the process. For the first time in 30 years, I chose truth over fear." On June 22, 1995, Linda Marie Carmichael walked into the Portland Police Department. She was 47 years old, graying and weathered by decades of hiding. She asked to speak to a detective. When Detective Rachel Torres arrived, Linda took a deep breath and said the words she'd been rehearsing for months. My name is Linda Carmichael. I've been missing since 1964, and I need to tell you what really happened. Detective Torres, thinking this was either a prank or a delusion, nevertheless listened. As Linda provided details, her parents' names, her brother's name, specific facts about her life and disappearance that only Linda would know, Torres' skepticism transformed into shock. I excused myself and ran to my computer, Torres later recalled. I pulled up the case file and my God, everything matched. The age, the description, the details. This woman was either Linda Carmichael or she'd studied the case so thoroughly she could replicate everything perfectly. The verification process was both simple and complicated. Simple because Linda still had her original social security number memorized. She'd never used it, but she'd never forgotten it. Complicated because after 31 years, confirming identity required more than memory. Police contacted the FBI, who located Linda's original fingerprints from her high school records. All students had been fingerprinted in 1963 during a safety initiative. A forensic technician took Linda's prints and compared them. 20 minutes later, the technician emerged from the lab looking pale. "It's her," he said. "It's a match. Linda Carmichael is alive." The police station erupted in controlled chaos. Detectives pulled files, supervisors made calls, someone contacted the Washington State Police. And Detective Torres sat across from Linda, still processing the impossible reality in front of her. But now came the hardest part, notifying the family. Linda begged the police to handle it carefully, to prepare them somehow for the shock. "My mother is dying," she told them. "Please, I need to see her before she goes. But I don't want the news to kill her." Detective Torres contacted the Crescent Falls Police Department, who in turn contacted the Carmichael family's local pastor, Reverend Michael Hayes. Reverend Hayes had known the family for decades and agreed to break the news gently. On June 23, 1995, he visited Margaret Carmichael in her hospice room, where she lay surrounded by photographs of her lost daughter. Tommy Carmichael, now 43 years old, sat beside his mother's bed. Robert Carmichael had died in 1987, his death certificate listing complications from cirrhosis. The drinking had finally killed him. The Reverend sat down, took Margaret's frail hand, and said words that seemed impossible. "Margaret, they found Linda. She's alive." Margaret Carmichael's first reaction was disbelief. "No," she whispered, "that's not possible. Linda died in 1964. But Reverend Hayes gently explained what the police had told him, that Linda had run away, that she was alive, that she wanted to see her mother. Margaret's face went through a dozen expressions in seconds. Confusion, shock, denial, hope, anger, joy, pain, all flickering across her features like shadows. Tommy, sitting beside her, began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs of a man who just learned his sister wasn't murdered, wasn't dead, had been alive all this time. "Where is she?" Margaret finally asked, her voice breaking. "I need to see her. I need to see my daughter." Within hours, arrangements were made. Linda would fly to Washington the next morning. After 31 years, mother and daughter would reunite. Linda Carmichael hadn't set foot in Washington since September 1964. As her plane descended toward Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, she looked out the window at the landscape she'd once called home and felt terror unlike anything she'd experienced in 3 decades. A police escort was waiting, both for her protection and to help facilitate the reunion. Detective Morrison, who'd worked Linda's case in 1964 and was now months from retirement, had insisted on being there. "I spent 31 years thinking this girl was dead," he told his colleagues. "I need to see her alive with my own eyes." The drive from Seattle to the hospice facility in Crescent Falls took 90 minutes. Linda spent the entire trip in silence, staring out the window, watching familiar landmarks appear. The old railroad bridge, the turnoff to her childhood street, the church where her mother used to sing. Everything had changed. Everything was the same. The hospice was quiet, filled with that particular hush that exists in places where people go to die peacefully. Linda walked down the corridor, her legs shaking, Detective Morrison and a hospice social worker flanking her for support. Outside room 217, Tommy Carmichael was waiting. Brother and sister stood facing each other for the first time in 31 years. Tommy was no longer the 12-year-old boy she'd left behind. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and deep lines around his eyes. Lines carved by grief. "Linda," he whispered, as if saying her name might make her disappear again. "It's me," she answered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Tommy." I'm so sorry. They embraced, both sobbing, years of loss pouring out in that moment. After several minutes, Tommy pulled back and took Linda's hand. Mom's waiting, he said. She's been waiting for 31 years. Linda stepped into the room. Margaret Carmichael lay in the hospital bed, oxygen tubes in her nose, her body ravaged by cancer, but her eyes. Her eyes were bright and alert and fixed on the doorway. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply looked at each other, mother and daughter, separated by 3 decades of absence. Margaret's lips trembled. Linda, she breathed, her voice barely audible. Mama, Linda replied, the word she hadn't spoken since she was 16. She crossed to the bed, knelt down, and took her mother's hands. Margaret touched Linda's face with trembling fingers, tracing her features as if confirming she was real. I thought you were dead, Margaret whispered. I mourned you. I buried you. I know, Linda sobbed. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. What followed was hours of conversation, of explanations, of painful truths finally spoken aloud. Linda told her mother everything. Why she ran, where she'd been, what her life had been like. She explained her fear of Robert, her desperate escape, the accidental evidence that made everyone think she'd been murdered. Margaret listened, her expression shifting between pain and understanding. When Linda finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that broke everyone in the room. I knew your father hurt you. I knew, and I didn't stop it, and I've lived with that guilt every day since you disappeared. I thought he'd killed you. I thought I'd failed you so completely that you died because I was too weak to protect you. She gripped Linda's hand with surprising strength. But you saved yourself. You survived. And I'm so proud of you for that. Mother and daughter spent the next week together, making up for lost time in the only way possible. Talking, reminiscing, filling in the gaps of 31 missing years. Margaret showed Linda photographs of Tommy's wedding, of the grandchildren Linda had never met. Linda told her mother about the books she'd read, the places she'd lived, the woman she'd become. They didn't talk much about the pain. There was too much of it and too little time. Instead, they focused on what remained: love, forgiveness, connection. Reverend Hayes visited daily, helping both women navigate the complex emotions of their reunion. Tommy brought his children to meet their aunt, a woman they'd only known as a name on a gravestone. The grandchildren were confused but gentle, sensing the weight of the moment. On July 2nd, 1995, 9 days after Linda's return, Margaret Carmichael died. She passed peacefully in her sleep, with Linda holding one hand and Tommy holding the other. The hospice staff later said they'd never seen someone hold on so determinedly, willing themselves to live just long enough to see a miracle. Margaret had been given weeks to live, but she'd stretched those weeks until Linda came home. Once she saw her daughter alive, once she knew the truth, once she'd forgiven and been forgiven, she let go. Linda grieved, but differently than she'd expected. I got to say goodbye, she told Detective Torres in a follow-up interview. For 31 years, I thought I'd never have that. I thought I'd live and die with that regret, but I got 9 days. 9 days of truth, and that's more than I deserved. Linda's return from the dead created legal chaos. She'd been declared legally dead in 1972, which meant her death certificate had to be revoked. Her social security number had been deactivated. She had no official identity as Linda Carmichael. All her documents, her credit history, her employment records existed under the name Elizabeth Carter. Lawyers spent months untangling the mess. Meanwhile, Linda faced a different kind of chaos: media attention. The story of a woman found alive after being presumed dead for 3 decades was national news. Reporters camped outside Tommy's house. Television producers called offering interview deals. Linda declined them all. I didn't come forward for attention, she said firmly. I came forward to see my mother and tell the truth. That's done. Now I just want to rebuild my life. The reaction in Crescent Falls was mixed. Some people were overjoyed, viewing Linda's survival as a miracle. Others were angry, feeling she'd deceived them, let them mourn unnecessarily, wasted police resources. One woman who'd been in Linda's high school class confronted her outside the grocery store. Do you have any idea what your disappearance did to this town? We searched for you. We cried for you. My father was on the search team that found your bloody clothes. It haunted him for years. Linda stood there, taking the anger, because what could she say? The woman was right. Her disappearance had created ripples of pain that touched dozens of lives. Intentions didn't erase impact. Detective Morrison, now retired, defended Linda in the local newspaper. She was a terrified 16-year-old girl escaping abuse. She made the best decision she could with the information she had. Judging her 3 decades later is easy. Living through it was not. Tommy Carmichael struggled with complex emotions. He loved his sister and was grateful she was alive, but he'd also lost his childhood to her disappearance. "My parents were destroyed by losing Linda," he told a counselor. "My dad drank himself to death. My mom lived with a broken heart for 31 years. I grew up in a house full of ghosts." Therapy sessions helped Tommy and Linda work through the tangled feelings of reunion and resentment. Slowly, carefully, they rebuilt their relationship. Tommy's children, less burdened by history, accepted their aunt without reservation, and their easy affection helped bridge the gap between siblings. By the end of 1995, Tommy and Linda had reached a fragile but genuine reconciliation. "She's my sister," Tommy said simply. "I've already lost her once. I'm not losing her again." Linda remained in Washington, wanting to be close to Tommy and rebuild some connection to her roots. She got a job at the Crescent Falls Public Library, an eerie echo of the library job she'd held in Oregon. She legally reclaimed her birth name, becoming Linda Marie Carmichael once again, though she kept Elizabeth Carter as a middle name, honoring the identity that had sheltered her for 3 decades. She rented a small apartment on the other side of town from her childhood home, unable to face living on Elm Street again. Some nights she drove past the old house, now owned by strangers, and wondered about the girl who'd lived there, terrified and desperate. That girl felt both intimately familiar and impossibly distant. In 1996, Linda began speaking publicly about her experience, not to media, but to small groups working with domestic violence survivors and runaway youth. She talked about the desperation that drives people to vanish, the unintended consequences of survival, the complexity of trauma and choice. Her story resonated deeply. After one talk, a teenage girl approached her crying. "My dad hurts my mom," the girl whispered. "I've been thinking about running away. But after hearing your story, I'm going to talk to a counselor instead." Linda held the girl while she cried, and later told Tommy, "If my story helps even one person make a better choice than I did, then maybe the last 31 years weren't completely wasted." 1 year after her return, Linda held a private ceremony at Crescent Falls Cemetery. She stood before the gravestone that bore her name, accompanied by Tommy, Reverend Hayes, and a handful of close family friends. They didn't remove the stone. It felt wrong to erase that marker of what her family had endured. Instead, they added a small plaque beneath it. "Lost 1964, found 1995. Love never dies." Linda placed flowers on her own grave and spoke to her younger self, the terrified 16-year-old who'd made an impossible choice. "I forgive you. You did the best you could. You survived, and that's enough." It was a moment of closure, strange and painful and necessary. Margaret's actual grave was nearby, and Linda visited it too, kneeling in the grass to have one more conversation with her mother, this one without the weight of secrets between them. The legal system also found closure. In 1997, Linda's case was officially closed, not as a homicide, not as a missing persons case, but as a resolution. The blood-stained cardigan and other items found in the forest were returned to Linda, carefully preserved in evidence bags for over 30 years. She couldn't bring herself to look at them. Detective Morrison, who'd carried guilt for decades over not finding her, visited Linda to apologize. "I should have looked harder," he said. "I should have considered more possibilities." Linda shook her head. "You looked for a victim. How could you have known I was out there, alive and hiding? I don't blame you, detective." "I never did." Morrison left that meeting with tears in his eyes, a weight he'd carried for 3 decades finally lifted. By the late 1990s, Linda had built something resembling peace. She had her brother, her nieces and nephews, her work at the library, her advocacy for abuse survivors. She'd stopped looking over her shoulder. She'd stopped living in fear. She never married, never had children of her own, but she found fulfillment in other ways. One of her nieces, inspired by Linda's journalism dreams, pursued a career in investigative reporting and dedicated her first published article to Aunt Linda, who taught me that truth matters. Linda framed that article and hung it in her apartment, a reminder that even broken paths can lead somewhere meaningful. Linda Carmichael lived the rest of her life quietly, dying in 2019 at the age of 71 from natural causes. Her obituary was unusual. It listed 2 life spans. Linda Marie Carmichael, 1948 to 1964, 1995 to 2019. At her funeral, Tommy stood at the podium and spoke about his sister's courage, her flaws, her complexity. Linda made choices that hurt people, including me, he said. But she also survived something terrible and eventually found the strength to face the consequences of her survival. That takes a kind of bravery that's hard to quantify. He paused, looking at the casket. This time we're really saying goodbye. And this time I'm grateful we had the chance to say it properly. Linda was buried beside her mother, their graves finally containing the truth of their relationship. Complicated, painful, but ultimately rooted in love. The story of Linda Carmichael raises questions that have no easy answers. Was she right to run? Absolutely. She was escaping abuse, saving her own life. Was she wrong to stay hidden? It's impossible to say. The 16-year-old who made that choice couldn't have predicted the decades of grief her absence would cause. What we can say is this. Linda's story reveals the ripple effects of violence, the impossible choices trauma forces upon people, and the way silence compounds pain across time. It also reveals something else. That truth, no matter how delayed, has power. Linda's 9 days with her mother didn't erase 31 years of absence, but they provided closure that neither woman thought possible. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes coming home, even after 30 years, is still worth the journey. Linda Carmichael's case is not unique, though it is rare. Every year, people disappear. Some by choice, some by force, some into circumstances too complex to categorize. The National Missing Persons Database contains thousands of cases spanning decades, each one representing a family trapped in uncertainty, waiting for answers that may never come. Linda's return from the dead after 3 decades is exceptional, but it reminds us that missing persons cases are never truly closed until they're resolved. It reminds us that behind every case file is a human story, nuanced and complicated, that can't be reduced to simple categories of victim or villain, lost or found. The people who vanish carry stories with them, and sometimes those stories take 30 years to be told. If Linda's story teaches us anything, it's the critical importance of intervention before disappearance becomes the only option. Domestic violence, abuse, and family trauma don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in communities where neighbors hear arguments, teachers see bruises, friends sense fear. Modern systems have improved since 1964. Mandatory reporting laws, domestic violence hotlines, youth services, and advocacy organizations now exist to provide escape routes that don't require vanishing completely. But they only work if people use them and if communities stay vigilant. Linda once said in an interview, "I thought running away and disappearing was my only choice. If I'd known there were people who could have helped me, who would have believed me and protected me, maybe I wouldn't have needed to become someone else for 30 years. Her words remain a powerful call to awareness. It's important to remember that Linda's story, as extraordinary as it is, began with an ordinary family. The Carmichaels weren't monsters or anomalies. They were regular people dealing with problems that escalated into crisis. Robert Carmichael was, by some accounts, a charming man when sober, someone who'd once been a loving father before alcohol and anger consumed him. Margaret Carmichael was a kind woman who loved her children, but found herself trapped in a cycle she didn't know how to escape. Linda was a bright, curious teenager whose life was derailed by circumstances beyond her control. Their tragedy was painfully common. What made it extraordinary was not the abuse itself, but the extreme response it forced and the unlikely resolution decades later. Their story is a reminder that behind every headline, every statistic, every case number, are real human beings making impossible choices. Looking at Linda Carmichael's full lifespan, we see a woman who lived essentially 3 different lives. First, Linda Carmichael, 1948 to 1964. A young girl growing up in a small town, dreaming of journalism, enduring hidden trauma. Second, Elizabeth Carter, 1964 to 1995. A woman in hiding, building a careful existence under a false identity, living with secrets and loneliness. Third, Linda Carmichael again, 1995 to 2019. A woman reclaimed, reunited with family, finding peace and purpose in advocacy and truth. Each life was real. Each life mattered. And the fact that they all belonged to the same person, that one woman contained all these fractured identities, speaks to the incredible resilience and complexity of the human experience. We contain multitudes, we survive, we transform, we find ways to live with what we've done and what's been done to us. Today, Crescent Falls is a quiet town, much changed from the place Linda Carmichael fled in 1964. The timber mill closed in the 1980s. The high school was renovated. Many of the people who knew the Carmichaels have passed away or moved on. But Linda's story remains part of the town's collective memory, a strange and haunting tale passed down as both cautionary and inspirational. The house on Elm Street, where Linda grew up, is now painted a cheerful yellow and houses a young family who know nothing of its history. The library where Linda worked in her final years has a small plaque in the reading room, dedicated to her memory, honoring her work with literacy programs and youth advocacy. Life moved on, as it always does. But the echoes of her story remain, reminding us that every vanishing leaves a mark, and every return is a kind of miracle. As of today, there are over 600,000 missing persons cases reported in the United States each year. Most are resolved quickly. Children found within hours, adults located safe within days. But some cases stretch on for months, years, decades. Families wait by phones that don't ring. They search databases and morgue records. They age with uncertainty, never able to fully grieve or fully hope. Linda Carmichael's story is exceptional because it ended with answers, with reunion, with closure. But for every Linda who returns, there are countless others who remain missing, their stories unfinished, their families suspended in eternal waiting. If you know someone who's missing, if you have information about an unresolved case, if you see something that doesn't seem right, speak up. Make the call. One piece of information can bring someone home. 30 years is too long to wait. The psychological toll of having a missing family member is profound and unique. It's called ambiguous loss, grief without closure, mourning without confirmation. Tommy Carmichael once described it as living in a house where every room is a question mark. He grew up celebrating birthdays for a sister who might be dead, setting a place at Christmas dinner for someone who might never come home, maintaining hope while preparing for devastation. It affects everything, he told a researcher studying families of missing persons. Relationships, mental health, your ability to trust the world, you're always waiting, always wondering, always split between hope and despair. Even after Linda returned, Tommy continued to see a therapist, working through 3 decades of complicated grief that didn't simply vanish because his sister reappeared. Her return brought joy, but it couldn't erase the years of pain. Healing from absence takes time, even when presence is restored. If Linda Carmichael had disappeared today instead of in 1964, her story would likely have unfolded very differently. Modern technology, cell phone tracking, social media footprints, interconnected databases, facial recognition, DNA analysis, makes vanishing completely far more difficult. Today, Linda's attempt to board a bus would likely be captured on security cameras. Her use of a false social security number would trigger alerts. Her presence in any digital system would leave traces that investigators could follow. This is both reassuring and troubling. Reassuring because it means genuinely missing people are easier to locate. Troubling because it means people fleeing dangerous situations have fewer places to hide. If I'd tried to run away in 2020 instead of 1964, Linda once mused in an interview, I probably would have been found within a week. And I don't know if that would have saved me or endangered me. Technology is a tool, neutral until directed. The question is whether we use it to protect or to control. Linda spent the last 2 decades of her life working with therapists to process the trauma of her childhood, her decades in hiding, and the complicated aftermath of her return. She was diagnosed with complex PTSD, anxiety, and depression, understandable responses to a life lived under constant fear and secrecy. Her therapist, Dr. Angela Wu, later wrote a paper on Linda's case, titled Identity Fracture and Resilience, a case study in survival and reintegration. In it, Dr. Wu noted that Linda's ability to create and maintain a functional false identity for 31 years required extraordinary psychological compartmentalization. She essentially became 2 people, Dr. Wu wrote. Linda and Bate existed simultaneously in her mind, and she had to constantly police the boundary between them. The cognitive and emotional labor this required was immense. When Linda finally integrated her 2 identities after returning, she experienced what Dr. Wu called identity grief, mourning the loss of Elizabeth Carter, who'd also been real, who'd also mattered. After Linda's death in 2019, Tommy found boxes of journals in her apartment, decades of writing, chronicling her thoughts, fears, and experiences. She'd kept these journals in secret, even after coming forward, private conversations with herself that she'd never shared. With Tommy's permission, excerpts were published in a book titled The Woman Who Disappeared, Linda Carmichael's journals. The entries are heartbreaking. One from 1978 reads, "Today I saw a mother and daughter shopping together, laughing. The daughter looked about 16. I wanted to run up to them and scream, 'I have a mother too.' I used to laugh with her, but I can't. I've built this prison out of fear and I don't know how to escape it." Another from 1994, "I'm 46 years old, my mother is dying. And I'm still too much of a coward to tell her I'm alive. What kind of daughter does that make me?" Linda's story has been the subject of multiple documentaries, podcasts, and books, each trying to make sense of her extraordinary life. Some focus on the mystery of her disappearance. Others examine the psychological aspects of living under a false identity. Still others use her case to discuss domestic violence, failure of social systems, and the complexity of choice. Each interpretation captures part of the truth, but no single narrative can contain the entirety of a life as complicated as Linda's. Tommy Carmichael, protective of his sister's memory, carefully vets every project, declining those that sensationalize or simplify. "Linda wasn't a hero or a villain," he tells producers. "She was a person who made the best choice she could in an impossible situation, and then lived with the consequences for 30 years. That's the story. Not more, not less." One practical outcome of Linda's case was renewed attention to age progression technology and long-term missing persons investigations. When Linda resurfaced in 1995, she looked nothing like the 16-year-old girl in the missing persons photos from 1964. 31 years had transformed her completely. This raised an important question. How many other missing persons might be living under different identities, unrecognizable from their outdated photos? The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children began investing more heavily in age progression imaging, creating updated photos of long-term missing persons, showing what they might look like decades later. Linda's case proved that people don't stay frozen at the age they disappeared. They age, they change, they become strangers even to those who knew them best. Finding them requires acknowledging and anticipating that transformation. Linda's legal journey to restore her identity illuminated gaps in the system that other, returned persons have since benefited from. The process of revoking a death certificate, reactivating a social security number, and reclaiming an identity legally declared deceased was complicated and time-consuming in 1995, requiring multiple court appearances and bureaucratic hurdles. In response, several states have streamlined procedures for identity restoration in cases of people found alive after being declared dead. Linda worked with legal advocates to create clearer pathways for these rare but significant cases. "I had resources and support," she told a legislative committee in 1998. "Not everyone who comes back from the dead, legally or metaphorically, will be so fortunate. The system should make it easier, not harder, for people to reclaim their lives." Her testimony contributed to reforms that have helped dozens of people navigate similar situations. What made Linda's story resonate so deeply with the public wasn't just the mystery or the unusual circumstances. It was the hope. In a world full of unresolved disappearances, tragic endings, and families who never get answers, Linda's return was a rare happy ending, or at least a resolved ending. It proved that miracles sometimes actually happen, that people given up for dead can come home, that closure, even decades delayed, is possible. This hope is dangerous and necessary in equal measure. Dangerous because it can keep families of missing persons in prolonged denial, unable to accept likely realities. Necessary because without hope, how do you keep searching? How do you keep believing? Linda understood this tension. "I want families to have hope," she said in an interview. "But I also want them to have support, resources, and realistic expectations. Hope alone isn't enough. You need systems, you need people who care, you need community. Hope needs company." Tommy Carmichael, now in his 70s, still lives in Washington and remains active in missing persons advocacy. He speaks at conferences, works with support groups for families of missing persons, and maintains Linda's legacy through the Carmichael Foundation, a nonprofit that provides resources for domestic violence survivors and runaway youth. "My sister's disappearance shaped my entire life," Tommy says. "But her return gave me a second chance to know her, to forgive her, to understand her. Not everyone gets that chance. So I work to make sure that families who are still searching have support, regardless of the outcome." He keeps 2 photographs on his desk, one of Linda at 16, the girl who vanished, and one taken in 1996, showing him and his sister together at a family barbecue, smiling, reconnected. Both of these are Linda, he says. Both of these are real. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, feeling desperate, considering running away, please know there are better options than vanishing. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, the National Runaway Safe Line, local shelters, school counselors, trusted adults. These resources exist to help people escape danger without having to erase their entire identity. Linda Carmichael would be the first to tell you, running away saved her life, but it also cost her 31 years. Modern systems are far from perfect, but they're better than they were in 1964. You don't have to face danger alone. You don't have to disappear to survive. Ask for help, make the call, tell someone what's happening. It's terrifying, yes. But living under a false identity for 3 decades, while your family mourns you, is also terrifying. There are people who will believe you, who will protect you, who will help you find a safe path forward. Please let them try. There's a particular cruelty in being mourned while still alive. Linda once described reading her own obituary, the one published after she'd been declared legally dead in 1972, and feeling as if she were attending her own funeral from a distance. They talked about who I'd been at 16, she said. They froze me at that age in that moment. They couldn't know I was still growing, still changing, still living. I became a symbol of loss, while the real me was just trying to survive. This dislocation, being simultaneously dead and alive, present and absent, grieved and surviving, created a psychological split that took decades of therapy to heal. Linda's experience highlights something rarely discussed. That disappearance is a trauma not just for those left behind, but for those who disappear. The missing person carries their own absence like a weight, living with the knowledge that somewhere, people are mourning a ghost. If we trace Linda's face through photographs, the few that exist, we see a visual record of transformation. At 16 in her school portrait, she looks young and uncertain, eyes that haven't yet learned to hide. In the few photos from her years as Elizabeth Carter, taken at work events she couldn't avoid, she looks guarded, her smile not reaching her eyes, her posture slightly defensive. In photographs from after her return, particularly in her later years, something has softened. The guardedness remains, but there's also peace, the peace of someone who's put down a burden they've carried too long. Her face tells the story her words sometimes couldn't, of fear, of hiding, of survival, of eventual freedom. We age according to how we live. Linda's aging was complicated by decades of secrecy, and her face, in the end, showed both the cost and the relief of finally living as herself. In 2014, Crescent Falls High School held a memorial event on the 50th anniversary of Linda's disappearance. Linda attended, now 66 years old, facing classmates she hadn't seen since September 1964. The reunion was awkward and emotional. Some former classmates embraced her warmly. Others kept their distance, still processing the complexity of her story. Jennifer Moore, the classmate who'd seen Linda leaving school that final day, approached with tears streaming down her face. "I've wondered for 50 years what happened to you," Jennifer said. "I thought maybe if I'd stopped you, if I'd asked where you were going, maybe I could have prevented something terrible." Linda took Jennifer's hands. "You couldn't have known, and nothing you could have done would have changed what I was running from. Please don't carry guilt that isn't yours." They held each other, 2 women in their 60s, bridging a 50-year gap with tears and forgiveness. One unexpected aspect of Linda's story is how it continues to resonate in the digital age. Linda's case has been discussed on true crime podcasts, analyzed on Reddit forums, and featured in TikTok videos explaining famous missing persons cases. New generations discover her story and respond with empathy and fascination. Comment sections fill with people sharing their own experiences of family trauma, of running away, of secrets kept. Some criticize Linda for the pain she caused her family. Others defend her fiercely, understanding the desperation of her choice. The debates are passionate and revealing, showing how her story touches raw nerves about family, duty, survival, and forgiveness. Linda, who died just as social media was becoming ubiquitous, never fully experienced this digital afterlife. But her story, endlessly shareable and deeply human, has found new audiences who keep her memory alive in ways she never could have imagined. Linda's case is now taught in criminal justice, social work, and psychology programs as an example of the complex interplay between domestic violence, missing persons investigations, and systemic failures. Students analyze the case from multiple angles. What warning signs were missed? How could the community have intervened? What policies might have prevented Linda's disappearance? What systems failed both Linda and her family? These academic discussions serve a purpose beyond intellectual exercise. They train future professionals to recognize patterns, to ask better questions, to consider alternatives beyond the obvious explanations. Linda Carmichael's case teaches us that missing and murdered aren't always the only options, one professor tells his class. Sometimes people are missing because they chose to be, and our job is to understand why, and to create systems that give people better choices. Linda, who dreamed of being a journalist, ended up educating people in a different way, through the story of her life becoming a case study in survival. If you trace Linda's physical journey from 1964 to 1995 on a map, you see a path that winds through Washington, California, and Oregon. Hundreds of miles traveled, dozens of towns lived in. A geography of hiding. Each place represented a temporary refuge, never quite safe enough to call home. She moved frequently, always worried that someone from her past would recognize her, that her carefully constructed identity would crumble. "I was always a stranger," she once reflected. "Even in places where I lived for years, I held myself apart. I couldn't put down roots because roots require truth, and I was built on lies." This rootlessness, this perpetual displacement, was another cost of her disappearance, not just the years lost, but the inability to truly belong anywhere. Home wasn't a place for Linda. It was a state of being she couldn't access while living as someone else. One of the most meaningful aspects of Linda's later life was her work with a support group for people who'd changed their identities to escape abuse. This group, which met monthly in Portland, consisted of people who'd legally or illegally assumed new identities to survive domestic violence, stalking, or other dangerous situations. Unlike Linda, most had done so with legal support, witness protection programs, legal name changes, relocated housing, but they shared her experience of living with a fractured sense of self. "It was the first time I could talk about what it felt like to be two people," Linda said. "To have a secret identity, a past life you couldn't acknowledge. These people understood in ways no therapist could." The group validated her experience and helped her understand that her choice, however complicated its consequences, had been a valid survival strategy. She wasn't crazy, she wasn't evil, she was human. 31 years is more than a lifetime for some and less than half of one for others. It's long enough for a child to be born, grow up, and have children of their own. It's long enough for technology to transform society. It's long enough for a person declared dead to become a ghost, and then, miraculously, a living person again. Linda often reflected on those 31 years, on what she'd gained and what she'd lost. "I survived," she said. "That's the gain. I built a life even if it was a limited one. I had friendships, work I enjoyed, small pleasures. But I lost my family during the years we could have had together. I lost my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, all those years when I could have built a real life with real connections under my real name. Was survival worth that cost? Yes. But that doesn't mean the cost wasn't devastating." Among Linda's personal effects, Tommy found dozens of letters she'd written over the years but never sent. Letters to her mother explaining everything. Letters to Tommy apologizing. Letters to her younger self offering forgiveness and understanding. Letters to the girl she might have been if she'd never had to run. "Dear Mama," one letter from 1983 begins, "I turned 35 today. You probably think I'd be 35 in heaven if you believe in heaven. But I'm 35 here in California, living under a fake name and thinking about you every single day. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I wanted to come home 1,000 times, but I didn't know how." These letters, never sent, never read by their intended recipients, are heartbreaking artifacts of a life lived in silence. They're also proof that Linda never stopped being connected to her family, even across decades and false identities. Love persisted, even when presence couldn't. The technology that might have found Linda in 1965 simply didn't exist. No interconnected databases, no DNA matching, no facial recognition, no digital footprints. Today's tools would likely have located her within months, if not weeks. But this raises an ethical question that missing persons advocates continue to debate. Should we use technology to find people who don't want to be found? Not all missing persons are victims of foul play. Some, like Linda, are in hiding for legitimate reasons. Using technology to locate them could put them in danger, returning them to the very situations they fled. The challenge, then, is creating systems sophisticated enough to distinguish between people who need to be found and people who need to stay hidden. It's a balance between protection and privacy, between the rights of families seeking closure and the rights of individuals seeking safety. Linda's case illustrates why this balance matters. The phrase empty chair syndrome refers to the phenomenon in families of missing persons, the constant awareness of absence, the metaphorical empty chair at every gathering. The Carmichael family lived with this for 31 years. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every birthday celebration carried the ghost of Linda's absence. Tommy later described it as learning to live around a hole in the shape of my sister. Even when Linda returned, the syndrome didn't entirely disappear. Those 31 years couldn't be refilled. The missed holidays, the uncelebrated milestones, the shared experiences that never happened, they remained as absence, a permanent empty space in the family's history. Linda's presence after 1995 was precious, but it couldn't retroactively fill the years she'd been gone. Some losses, once incurred, remain lost even after recovery. Linda's testimony before state legislative committees in the late 1990s helped shape reforms in how cases of domestic violence involving minors are handled. She advocated for better training for teachers and counselors to recognize signs of abuse, for clearer reporting protocols, and for resources specifically designed to help young people escape dangerous homes without having to disappear completely. If systems had existed in 1964 to help me safely leave my father, she told lawmakers, I wouldn't have needed to vanish. My family wouldn't have suffered 3 decades of grief. Better systems mean fewer disappearances. Her advocacy contributed to the expansion of youth shelters, domestic violence resources, and legal protections for minors seeking emancipation from abusive homes. These reforms, now commonplace, have likely prevented countless young people from making the desperate choice Linda made in 1964. Among Linda's most treasured possessions, found after her death, was a small music box her grandmother had given her when she was 10 years old. Somehow, impossibly, Linda had kept this music box through 31 years of hiding, moving it from apartment to apartment, California to Oregon. Elizabeth Carter's possession, becoming Linda Carmichael's again after her return. The music box played a simple melody, Für Elise. And when Tommy opened it after Linda's death, it still worked, the mechanism still intact after more than 50 years. Inside, Linda had placed a small piece of paper with writing in her teenage handwriting. Remember who you are. Tommy believes Linda wrote this note to herself in those early days of hiding, a reminder that beneath Elizabeth Carter's identity, Linda Carmichael still existed. That music box, small and fragile and persistent, became a symbol of Linda's survival, identity preserved through decades of disguise. The cultural context of disappearance has changed dramatically between 1964 and today. In 1964, missing persons cases received local attention at best, often dismissed as runaways or troublemakers. Media coverage was limited. Resources were scarce. By the 1980s and 90s, shows like Unsolved Mysteries brought missing persons cases into living rooms nationwide. The internet created databases where information could be shared instantly. Social media allowed families to organize search campaigns reaching millions. Today, missing persons can become national news within hours. This evolution in awareness and technology has saved lives, but it's also created new pressures and problems. Misinformation spreading rapidly, amateur sleuths interfering with investigations, privacy violations, the weaponization of search efforts. Linda's case exists across these eras, beginning in an age of silence and ending in an age of information overload. She witnessed this transformation firsthand. The psychological assessment Linda underwent after revealing herself provides fascinating insight into the human capacity for compartmentalization. Dr. Angela Wu's evaluations noted that Linda demonstrated exceptional ego strength and dissociative capability, which essentially means she was able to mentally separate her Linda identity from her Elizabeth identity so effectively that she could function normally despite living a fundamentally dishonest existence. This wasn't pathological dissociation, as seen in dissociative identity disorder. Linda always knew who she really was. Rather, it was adaptive dissociation, a survival mechanism that allowed her to maintain psychological stability while inhabiting a false identity. She couldn't have sustained this for 31 years without extraordinary mental resilience, Dr. Wu noted. But that resilience came at a cost. Chronic anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, and what Dr. Wu called perpetual existential exhaustion, the draining effort of constantly monitoring and controlling her identity presentation. Colleagues at the Crescent Falls Library, where Linda worked after her return, described her as meticulous, private, and deeply empathetic. She had a particular affinity for helping patrons research family history and genealogy, perhaps because she understood the importance of connection to one's past. One coworker, Maria Chen, remembered Linda helping an elderly man locate information about a sister he'd lost contact with decades earlier. Linda spent hours with him, searching records, making calls, Maria recalled. When they finally found his sister, still alive in another state, Linda cried as hard as he did. She told me, family connections are precious. Once you lose them, getting them back is a miracle. Linda's work took on deeper meaning when you understood her background. She wasn't just helping people find information. She was helping them avoid the losses she'd experienced. Each connection she facilitated was a small redemption. Crescent Falls, like any small town, had to process Linda's return collectively. Town hall meetings were held where residents could ask questions, express feelings, and work through the complex emotions her reappearance triggered. Some people were angry, some were relieved. Some didn't know what to feel. The mayor at the time, Patricia Wilson, approached these meetings with wisdom. Linda Carmichael's disappearance shaped this community for 3 decades. Her return doesn't erase that impact, but it gives us an opportunity to have conversations we should have been having all along. About domestic violence, about supporting vulnerable families, about how we respond to crisis. Linda's story is our story. We all failed in some way. Now we have a chance to learn and do better. Those meetings, difficult as they were, helped the community heal and helped Linda feel less like an outsider returning to hostile territory. One lasting contribution of Linda's case was its impact on how investigators approach long-term missing persons cases. Detective Morrison, before his retirement, wrote a training manual incorporating lessons from Linda's case. Key takeaways included: don't assume a missing person is dead without evidence. Don't close cases prematurely. Consider non-criminal explanations for disappearance. Preserve evidence and samples indefinitely. DNA technology evolves rapidly. Keep cases in public awareness. Someone who wouldn't have come forward in year 1 might do so in year 30. These principles seem obvious now, but in 1964, many were revolutionary. Linda's case, and others like it, helped transform missing persons investigations from short-term searches into long-term commitments. The assumption shifted from probably dead to still possibly findable. That shift has brought countless people home who might otherwise have remained lost. Near the end of her life, Linda was interviewed for an oral history project documenting domestic violence survivors. The interviewer asked what she'd want people to remember about her story. Linda thought for a long moment before answering. I'd want people to know that survival is complicated, that doing the right thing isn't always clear, that you can save your own life and still hurt people you love, that forgiveness of yourself and others is possible even after decades of pain. She paused, looking out the window at the familiar Washington landscape she'd once fled. I'd also want people to know that it's never too late to tell the truth. I thought it was. For 31 years, I convinced myself the moment had passed, that too much time had gone by, that coming forward would cause more harm than staying hidden. But I was wrong. Truth mattered. Reunion mattered. Those 9 days with my mother mattered more than anything else in my life. So if you're carrying a secret, hiding from something, convinced it's too late, it's not. It's never too late to come home. Linda's story is one of thousands, but it's also unique in its resolution. For every Linda Carmichael who returns after decades, there are dozens who never do, who remain missing, whose families never get answers, whose cases go cold and stay cold. The reality is that most long-term missing persons cases don't end in miraculous returns. They end in continued absence, in eventual death certificates issued without bodies, in families learning to live with perpetual uncertainty. This makes Linda's return all the more precious and all the more unusual. Her story can't be a template or expectation for other families. Every case is different. But it can be a reminder that investigation should continue, that hope can coexist with realism, and that sometimes, against all odds, missing people do come home. The work of searching, of keeping cases active, of never forgetting, that work matters, even when it doesn't produce the outcomes we want. Today, in Crescent Falls, there's a small memorial garden dedicated to missing persons from the region. It's a quiet space with benches and flowering plants, and on a stone wall, names are engraved. People who have disappeared over the decades, some found, some still missing. Linda Carmichael's name appears there, but with a unique notation. Lost 1964, found 1995. It's the only name on the wall with such an addition. Tommy Carmichael maintains the garden, planting new flowers each spring, keeping the memorial clean and peaceful. I take care of this place for Linda, he says, but also for all the families who never got what we got, a second chance. This garden is for absence and presence both. It honors those who never came home, but it also celebrates the miracle that sometimes they do. It's a place of grief and hope intertwined, acknowledging both the pain of disappearance and the possibility, however slim, of return. The resources available today for people in Linda's situation are imperfect, but vastly better than in 1964. Youth shelters, domestic violence hotlines, legal advocacy organizations, witness protection programs, family courts with emergency protective orders. These systems exist specifically to prevent people from needing to vanish completely to escape danger. Organizations like the National Network for Youth and the National Domestic Violence Hotline provide confidential support, safety planning, and alternatives to running away without support. These resources aren't perfect. They're underfunded, sometimes overwhelmed, and don't reach everyone who needs them. But they represent progress. They represent society acknowledging that people like 16-year-old Linda Carmichael shouldn't have to choose between staying in danger or disappearing into a false identity. If even one young person today finds help through these systems and doesn't have to repeat Linda's desperate choice, then the lessons of her story have mattered. In her final years, Linda found something she'd never had before: peace. She'd lived long enough to reconcile with her past, to rebuild relationships with family, to contribute meaningfully through advocacy, and to forgive herself for the choices she'd made as a frightened teenager. She still had nightmares. She still sometimes caught herself responding to bait instead of Linda. She still felt the loss of those 31 years keenly. But she'd made peace with the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. On her final birthday in 2019, just months before her death, Tommy threw a small party with close friends and family. Linda looked around the room at people who knew her full story and loved her anyway, and she said quietly, "I'm home. Finally, truly home." It had taken 71 years, 31 of them lost to hiding, but Linda Carmichael had found her way back to herself. And that, in the end, was its own kind of miracle. The story of Linda Carmichael, the girl who vanished, the woman who hid, the person who returned, remains a testament to the complexity of human survival, the enduring power of truth, and the possibility of redemption even after decades of absence. Her life asks us to consider difficult questions about family, duty, forgiveness, and the choices we make when all options seem impossible. It reminds us that behind every missing person poster, every cold case file, every unsolved disappearance, is a human story we may never fully understand. And it offers this fragile, precious hope that sometimes those we've lost can still come home, that truth, however delayed, still matters, that forgiveness, however difficult, is possible, that it's never too late, never to reclaim yourself. In our next story, we'll explore another case that defies explanation. The man who appeared in a locked room with no memory of who he was, speaking a language no one could identify, carrying documents from a country that doesn't exist. The mystery of the man from nowhere. Until then, remember, every person who's missing is someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's story. They're waiting to be found, to be understood, to come home.